You were kind, but they were strategic. You apologized first even when they were the one who crossed the line. You said yes when everything in you was screaming no. You gave them space, time, love, more than they ever earned. You stayed even when the silence grew louder than their words. And they learned something dangerous. That your goodness could be used like a leash. To pull you back when you started to drift away. To shut you up the moment you questioned something. To keep you small, predictable, easy. They didn't have to scream. They didn't have to threaten. All they had to do was let you believe that your kindness was your identity. That stepping away from it even for a moment would make you the bad one. So you stayed, even when it hurt. Even when they used your silence as a mirror for their dominance. Even when your voice began to fade, replaced by the quiet echo of guilt and confusion. You told yourself you were just being the bigger person. But deep down, a quiet voice kept asking, if this is what being good feels like, why do I feel so broken? And this isn't just a story about being nice. It's about how your need to be seen as good became the very thing that made you invisible. It's about how your desire to be accepted to avoid conflict, to please, to stay agreeable, gradually taught others how to bypass your boundaries without even needing to ask. Because the truth is, in a world that rewards dominance and punishes softness, kindness without boundaries is just vulnerability on display. And predators, emotional, psychological or relational, they smell that from a mile away. You were trained not just by them, but by a lifetime of messages that told you, don't make a fuss, don't hurt their feelings, be the bigger person. Good people forgive, good people don't fight back. But no one told you this. Good people burn out too. Good people get used up, then thrown away, especially when their goodness is never backed by self-respect. And Marcus Aurelius, emperor, philosopher, Stoic, was one of the kindest rulers Rome ever saw. He wrote in his private journals about compassion, about forgiving the weaknesses of others, about showing patience to even the most frustrating people. But Marcus did something you never learned to do. He never confused virtue with submission. He never saw goodness as something to be traded for approval. And he never not once allowed someone to violate his values in the name of keeping the peace. Because Marcus understood this. Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect. He was good, but he wasn't soft. He was fair, but he wasn't fragile. He knew the difference between being good and being pliable. Late. So maybe the real question is this. Was your kindness ever truly free, or was it a silent contract, traded for peace, validation, or love? And if they only stayed because you never said no, if they only praised your kindness when it kept them comfortable, then maybe they never really loved you. They just loved your obedience. And that realization, that's not bitterness. That's the beginning of clarity. Because now, you're here. Tired, maybe. Bruised, yes. But finally beginning to ask the one question that changes everything. What if I don't owe anyone the version of me that stays silent to be loved? Not anymore. It starts so subtly. They don't yell. They don't curse. They don't even raise their voice. But somehow, you always end up apologizing. Somehow, your schedule always bends around theirs. Somehow, your needs shrink, quietly, consistently, until they barely exist. And they never had to ask twice. They just looked disappointed, and you scrambled to fix it. They sighed heavily, and you offered to take the blame. They said, "It's fine," and you believed them, even when their eyes screamed otherwise. This is how manipulation wears perfume. It doesn't come with red flags and flashing lights. It comes dressed as emotional gravity, a force you can't see, but feel, pulling you into smaller and smaller spaces. You're not stupid. You're not weak. You're just trained. Trained to equate other people's comfort with your success. Trained to avoid being called difficult, too much, or selfish. Trained to believe that being liked means being agreeable, even when it costs you your truth. And somewhere along the way, your kindness stopped being a gift and became a currency. Something you used to buy approval, buy love, buy a spot in someone else's peace, even if it meant giving up your own. They don't have to say the words. You know the pattern. When you raise a concern, they call you dramatic. When you say no, they ask, "What happened to the old you?" When you draw a boundary, they say, "I miss when you were sweet." Sweet, as in compliant, as in easy to override, as in the version of you that didn't speak up when it hurt. They frame your resistance as regression, your growth as betrayal. So you fold, not because they forced you, but because somewhere deep inside, you still believe that being good means never upsetting anyone. That's not kindness, that's conditioning. Marcus Aurelius understood the danger of that trap. In his meditations, he didn't just speak about virtue, he spoke about discernment. He reminded himself daily that some people would lie, cheat, insult, or disrespect. And it was not his duty to please them, but to remain just without becoming complicit. He wrote, "When you wake each morning, remind yourself, today you will meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. None of them can harm me. And more importantly, none of them can define him." Because that's the turning point, isn't it? When you realize that kindness without self-definition becomes a weapon that anyone else can pick up and point at you. And when they do, they aim it at your guilt, your loyalty, your fear of being rejected, and they fire it again and again until you start believing that maybe you deserve to feel used. You don't. But the longer you let it happen, the more it becomes a loop. They take, you give, they expect, you comply. And each time, the leash tightens. So let's break that loop. Let's name it for what it is. You weren't too kind. You were trained to associate your worth with usefulness. You weren't overly sensitive. You were sensing exactly what was happening and told not to trust it. You weren't bad at boundaries. You were never taught that kindness without limits becomes consent to harm. This is not your shame. This is your awakening. Because once you see the leash, once you realize that what looked like love was just control with a smile, you don't go back. Not to the person who was easy to manage. Not to the version of you who bent until they broke. You start remembering what Marcus remembered every day. You are not obliged to be useful to those who would strip you of your dignity in the process. That is not kindness. That is surrender. And your soul wasn't built to kneel. There's a fear behind your kindness, but you rarely admit it. Because it's not loud, it doesn't shout, it whispers. In the quiet moments, after another yes you didn't mean, after another apology you didn't owe, after another sacrifice that left you empty, that fear says, if I stop being good, they'll stop loving me. And so, you stay agreeable. You stay small. You stay quiet, not because you lack a voice, but because somewhere deep inside, you're terrified of what might happen if you use it. You fear confrontation. You fear rejection. But most of all, you fear being seen as selfish. Because somewhere along the way, someone taught you that having needs makes you a burden. That protecting yourself makes you cold. That saying no is a betrayal. That asking for more is too much. So you swallow the discomfort. You downplay your intuition. You over-explain. You overgive. And when you finally break, you cry in silence because you don't want them to feel bad for what they did. That's not kindness. That's emotional captivity. Let's name the cycle for what it is. You were taught to trade your authenticity for approval, to be loved, not for who you are, but for how well you meet expectations. The moment you deviate, even slightly, you see the shift, the frown, the passive-aggressive silence, the guilt trip. You've changed. The shaming. You used to be so sweet. And so, you retreat. You regress back into the safe version of you. The version who doesn't rock the boat, who doesn't demand reciprocity, who doesn't challenge unfairness. Because challenging the system means risking exile. And to someone who's been wired to earn love through self-erasure, rejection doesn't just hurt, it feels like annihilation. But here's what Marcus Aurelius knew, and what you must begin to remember. If you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your own judgment about it, and you have the power to wipe that out now. He understood that the real prison is not the rejection of others. It's the judgment you attach to it. You think, if they're disappointed in me, I must be wrong. If they're pulling away, I must have gone too far. If they're angry, I must fix it. Number. Their discomfort does not define your morality. Their silence does not prove your guilt. And their love, if it vanishes the moment you say no, was never love. Because love, real love, does not require you to betray yourself. So let's flip the question. What if your fear is not about losing them, but about finally confronting how little they ever valued the real you? What if they only stayed because your kindness was convenient? Because your loyalty was easy? Because your boundaries were non-existent? That's a brutal truth. But there's freedom in seeing it. Because once you realize that your goodness was being exploited, not cherished, you stop begging for crumbs. You stop apologizing for having limits. You stop fearing your own power. And in its place, a different kind of kindness begins to grow. One that isn't desperate. One that isn't afraid. One that doesn't say yes out of fear of being unloved. That is Stoic kindness. The kind Marcus practiced. Rooted in dignity, not guilt. There's a version of you not far from here, who says no with clarity, who walks away without explanation, who doesn't break themselves to keep someone else comfortable, not because they've become cold, but because they've become clear. And maybe the most loving thing you'll ever do is finally love yourself more than the performance of being good. Because good isn't real if it costs you your soul. He ruled over one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, but he never let that power define his worth. He wrote about patience, about compassion, about tolerating the ignorance and flaws of others. He spoke softly, not because he was weak, but because he had no need to raise his voice to prove his authority. Marcus Aurelius was kind, but he was never manageable, never manipulated, never emotionally blackmailed, never forced into silence just to keep others comfortable. Because Marcus understood something most people don't. Kindness without boundaries isn't virtue. It's surrender. And surrender, in the name of pleasing others, is not what the Stoics stood for. We like to think that being good means being agreeable. That gentleness means silence. That empathy means giving until it hurts. But Marcus shattered that illusion every single day of his life. He was surrounded by sycophants, traitors, and those who tried to take advantage of his compassion. And yet, he didn't rage. He didn't seek revenge, but he also didn't shrink. Instead, he responded with clarity, with detachment, with a calm rooted in something deeper than approval. He wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." And in those words, he didn't just talk about walking away from cruelty. He talked about refusing to mirror it, refusing to let their chaos shape your choices, but also refusing to reward their behavior with passive silence. Because Marcus didn't equate being good with being agreeable. He equated it with being just. And justice, in Stoic philosophy, begins with self-respect. Let's pause on that. When was the last time you considered your self-respect as part of your moral code? Not just your kindness, not just your generosity, but your willingness to protect your own dignity even if it makes others uncomfortable. Because that's what Marcus practiced. He showed mercy to his enemies, but he never let them rewrite his values. He listened to criticism, but never let it mold his decisions. He forgave the flaws of others, but never allowed those flaws to corrupt his sense of what was right. That's not just Stoicism. That's spiritual discipline. Let's be honest. If Marcus were alive today, many would call him cold, detached, unyielding. Why? Because he wouldn't text back right away to prove he cared. He wouldn't explain himself endlessly just to soothe someone's insecurity. He wouldn't say yes when he meant no, just to avoid drama. He would offer peace. But if peace was refused, he would walk away without apology. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew caring doesn't mean abandoning yourself. And that's the difference between Stoic kindness and the self-erasing version you were taught. You were taught to be soft, even when it cost you your spine. Taught to say, "It's okay," when it wasn't. Taught to smooth the edges of your truth just to make others feel safe. But Marcus shows us another way. A way of living where your kindness is offered, not extracted. Where your silence is powerful, not fearful. Where your boundaries aren't walls but gates with conditions. Because not everyone deserves access. Not everyone can hold your goodness without trying to twist it. And Marcus? He didn't apologize for that. He didn't question himself for saying no. He didn't lose sleep over people who only loved the version of him they could influence. He held his ground, even if it meant standing alone. So maybe that's the lesson. You don't need to stop being good. You just need to stop being easy. You don't need to harden your heart. You just need to guard it wisely. And you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stop whispering when it matters most. Because kindness, real kindness, is not the act of letting people walk all over you with a smile. It's the decision to show up with love while refusing to disappear. That's what Marcus did. And if you're brave enough, you can too. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no dramatic breaking point, no outburst, no final straw. Instead, it's a slow erosion, a quiet crumbling. You start by letting the small things go. You shrug off the snide comment. You laugh at the joke that stings. You say, "It's okay," when it isn't just to keep the peace. And at first, you think it's noble, mature, emotionally intelligent. But somewhere along the way, you stop noticing how often you're the one swallowing pain. Until one day, you look in the mirror and you barely recognize the person staring back. Not because your face has changed, but because your voice is gone. You used to speak with clarity. You used to say what you wanted. You used to draw lines and stand by them. But now you hesitate before every answer. You second-guess every opinion. You ask yourself, will this make them upset? Before you even ask, is this true for me? That's not diplomacy. That's disappearance. And the worst part is, they don't even notice. They love you, they say. But they love the version of you that never challenges them, that never interrupts, that always accommodates. They love your patience, your warmth, your reliability, but they don't see what it costs. They don't hear the screaming inside your chest when you smile and say, "It's fine." They don't feel the ache in your gut when you say yes and mean no. They don't know the rage that builds every time you betray yourself just to avoid disappointing them. And eventually, you stop trying to be heard. Because what's the point of speaking if your silence is all they ever really wanted? Marcus Aurelius warned of this quiet death of the self. In Meditations, he didn't only reflect on virtue, he reflected on the danger of losing your own direction in the noise of other people's expectations. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. But what if your thoughts are no longer your own? What if your inner world has been repainted by years of pleasing, appeasing, avoiding conflict, and shrinking yourself to fit other people's comfort? Then, your soul, the very core of who you are, starts to fade into a color you don't even recognize. You weren't born a ghost, but kindness without limits made you one. A helpful ghost, a polite ghost, a ghost that never haunts anyone else, only itself. This isn't about blaming others. It's about finally confronting a deeper truth. You made yourself invisible to be loved. And now, you're unloved and invisible. That's the tragedy. You thought if you were good enough, kind enough, patient enough, you'd be safe. You'd be chosen. You'd be valued. But what you actually taught them was, they can forget you. They can bypass your needs. They can lean on your strength without ever asking what it costs you, because you'll never say a word. And over time, your silence became permission. Your kindness became expectation, and your presence became background noise. You're not hated. You're just overlooked. And that hurts more than hate ever could. But Marcus didn't live that way. He led with grace, yes. He ruled with restraint, absolutely. But he never allowed anyone to mistake his gentleness for weakness. Because his kindness came with self-possession, with dignity, with rootedness. And that's the difference. You've been kind to survive. He was kind because he could afford to be from a place of strength, not fear. That's what Stoicism teaches us. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone the watered-down version of your truth. Kindness means nothing if it costs your identity. So the next time you smile to make someone else comfortable, ask yourself, is this kindness, or is this the slow death of my voice? Because disappearing isn't noble. It's self-abandonment. And no one, not even the ones you love, is worth the price of losing yourself. You don't have to become cold. You don't have to stop caring. You don't have to transform into someone hardened, sharp-edged, or cruel. But you do have to because the kindness that got you here, the kind that kept you silent, compliant, and exhausted, is not the kind that will protect you anymore. That version of kindness came from fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of being alone. It was reactive. It was performative. It was survival. But now, something inside you is waking up. A voice. Not loud, but steady. Not angry, but unshakable. It says, I can still be kind, but not at the cost of myself. This is where the Stoics begin to guide you back to center. Because Stoic kindness is not about people-pleasing. It's not about image. It's not about avoiding confrontation. It's about acting in alignment with your values, no matter who's watching. That's what Marcus Aurelius did. Every single day. He dealt with liars, manipulators, opportunists. He met betrayal with composure, not submission. He met cruelty with clarity, not compliance. And still, he remained good. Not because others deserved it, but because he did. His goodness was never dependent on their response. It was an extension of his own self-respect. And that's where your shift begins. You start by recognizing. Saying no is not cruelty. It's clarity. Walking away is not weakness. It's wisdom. Being firm is not being mean. It's mature. You stop apologizing for your tone when you're simply being honest. You stop cushioning every truth to protect people from feelings they refuse to manage. You stop taking on the emotional labor of others just because you used to. And suddenly, your kindness becomes powerful. Not soft, not spineless, but grounded. It's the kind of kindness that says, I will help, but not be used. I will listen, but I will not shrink. I will forgive, but I will not forget how to protect myself next time. This is what Marcus taught through his own example. He held space for compassion, but not manipulation. He didn't lower his standards to avoid discomfort. He didn't pretend to agree when his soul knew better. Because Stoicism is not about being passive. It's about being principled. And kindness, when rooted in principle, becomes a shield, not a leash. You begin to choose your words more deliberately. You respond instead of react. You observe without absorbing. And most importantly, you decide what kind of treatment you will never again accept, no matter how nice they seem. You're not turning into someone else. You're finally returning to who you were before you were taught that kindness meant self-erasure. And yes, people will notice the shift. Some will resist it. They'll call you distant, cold, arrogant. But that's only because your boundaries break the system that made them comfortable. Let them be uncomfortable. You didn't come this far to stay silent for the rest of your life. You didn't endure years of inner erosion just to make other people feel safe in your presence. You don't need to be manageable. You need to be whole. So what does Stoic kindness look like? It looks like grace with discernment, presence without pressure, empathy without enabling. It's the calm refusal to participate in dynamics that drain you. The quiet strength to say, that doesn't work for me, without a paragraph of justification. The steady walk away, not with bitterness, but with finality. Because now, you know, you can be kind and still be untouchable. Marcus would have called it virtue, not the kind that's praised by others, but the kind that lets you look in the mirror and say, I didn't betray myself today. And maybe that's the kind of kindness you were meant to practice all along. They used to smile when you gave in. They used to call you so sweet when you stayed silent. They praised your patience, but never asked what it cost. They said you were good because you never said no. And maybe, back then, they were right. You were good. You were kind. You were careful. But most of all, you were afraid. Afraid to lose them. Afraid to be disliked. Afraid to speak and be misunderstood. So, you held your tongue. You folded your opinions. You dimmed your light to make others more comfortable in your presence. And in return, they loved you. Not for your soul, not for your truth, but for your silence. But now they try the same tactics and they don't land. Now, their disappointment doesn't move you like it used to. Now, you feel something growing where the fear used to live. Clarity. You still feel compassion. You still care. You still believe in goodness. But it's different now. Your kindness doesn't come from fear. It comes from integrity. Your silence isn't automatic anymore, it's intentional. You help because you want to. Not because you're terrified of what happens if you don't. And that shift? That's not small. That's not subtle. That's freedom. You've come a long way. From being the one who apologized for everything, to the one who now pauses and asks, is this mine to carry? From the one who broke themselves to keep the peace, to the one who now understands. Peace built on self-betrayal isn't peace, it's prison. You've learned that kindness without discernment becomes exploitation, That loyalty without boundaries becomes self-destruction. That silence, when misused, is just another way to disappear. And you've chosen to stop disappearing. Marcus Aurelius lived this truth in every word he left behind. He didn't roar. He didn't attack. He didn't control. He simply stood still, anchored in principle. He faced betrayal, disappointment, power games, emotional chaos, and yet he didn't become them. He didn't shrink. He didn't harden. He didn't erase himself to avoid being misunderstood. He remained kind, but never compliant. Generous, but never guilted. Compassionate, but never controlled. That is the Stoic kindness you now begin to walk with. It doesn't please everyone. It doesn't get applauded by people who benefited from your silence. But it protects something more important: your self-respect. So what happens now? Maybe you'll still say yes. Maybe you'll still forgive. Maybe you'll still stay up late to help someone who needs you. But it won't be automatic. It won't be out of fear. And it sure as hell won't be because someone made you feel guilty. Because you've remembered something essential. You don't have to stop being kind. You just have to stop being afraid of not being liked. And if they leave you because you said no, if they turn on you the moment you set a boundary, if they withdraw the moment you stop bending, then let them go. Let them leave. Because now you know, they never loved your kindness. They just loved how easy you were to control. And that version of you? She's gone. He's gone. You're gone. Not dead. Transformed. Still kind. Still compassionate. Still you. But finally, not quiet anymore. If this video made you stop and rethink the way you give your kindness, hit subscribe and share in the comments if you've ever felt used just for being good. You're not alone, and you never have to be silent again.